Now, Home Secretary Suella Braverman has accused the Met Police of double standards when it comes to policing protests, claiming that officers have a stern approach to aggressive right-wing activists, while pro-Palestinian protesters displaying so-called almost identical behaviour are largely ignored.
40 Just Stop Oil activists were arrested for disruptive action on Waterloo Bridge yesterday, and pressure is mounting on the Met to demonstrate the same no-nonsense strategy at any disruption on Saturday's organised protests, as the Prime Minister warns he will hold Met Chief Sir Mark Rowley wholly accountable for the march. So do the police have double standards in how they deal with the protest? Joining us now to discuss this, lawyer and author Luke Gittos, who thinks they do, and barrister and climate activist Paul Powlesland, who doesn't believe the police show bias with protesters. Thank you both for joining us. So, I mean, just kick us off on this. I mean, where is the bias? What's the greatest example of that bias?
The bias is that the police take operational decisions as to how to police particular protests. And I think increasingly in today's world, they are concerned about optics. They're concerned about what they perceive the public to think about how they police particular causes. And I think the reason we're discussing this is because there is a public perception that the police go softer on causes related to things like the environment and Black Lives Matter than they do on other things. And I think we've seen consistent examples of that. We've seen the social media footage circulating of the police not intervening to clear people off the roads when they're being blocked, people having to take their matters into their own hands. And of course, Paul will point to innumerable examples where the police have been heavy-handed against such protesters and have, you know, it's right to say that Just Stop Oil protesters have received substantial criminal sentences for what they've done and been sent to prison. But there are undoubtedly operational decisions about how these different demonstrations are policed, and I think that gives the understandable impression that they are politicised. Now, when it comes to Saturday, I think it's important to emphasise that the police do have independence from the government, and I don't think we should live in a world where the Home Secretary gets to dictate to the police precisely what operational decisions ought to be made. I think Mark Rowley has played this broadly correctly, but I do think the law needs to be enforced consistently. We have seen some real imaginative gymnastics on behalf of those supporting the demonstrations on Saturday, saying, oh, well, there's lots of different meanings of jihad, you know, there's lots of different ways that these marches can be interpreted. In the last few days, we've seen the Telegraph reporting that at least one of the groups organising it is related to Hamas. We've seen the involvement of extremely dangerous organisations in these protests. And so while I think actually most people agree that the protest should go ahead, I, by the way, think it's a historical tragedy that people are showing up at this time to march alongside and share a platform with Islamists, which is what is happening. It should be permitted to go ahead, but the law must be enforced.
Is it a historical tragedy to march 2 hours after a 2-minute silence, which is all that's happening on the Saturday? Or is it a historical tragedy that, you know, people don't feel like or people, if the protest were to be banned, would be stopped from actually expressing their opinion on a war that's happening?
If this was about peace, that protest would be asking Hamas to surrender. Okay. And it's not. This is a protest against Israel at the worst possible time.
So, Paul, to bring you in there, is it really about public perception? You know, public perception of whether Just Stop Oil are treated too unfairly, because I'm sure you'll, as Luke said there, you'll come up with instances where actually they were not treated unfairly.
We can play biased tennis all day, and you can pick out any different examples showing, as I would say, actually the police and the government are biased against environmental protesters. I myself don't go on Just Stop Oil marches because I'm worried about getting arrested and what that would do for my job, and I don't want to be held on remand like many Just Stop Oil protesters have been. But the fact is I don't think cherry-picking examples from either side is actually that helpful. What we need to do is to confirm our principles, which for me says we in Britain believe in free speech and the right to free assembly and protest, and then the law needs to be the same for everyone.
And that's the key thing, isn't it? It's when people end up breaking the law. And are you thinking of examples where people have broken the law and the police have been soft?
Yes. So, but taking Paul's point, the freedom to protest is not the freedom to assemble and demonstrate in any way you choose at any time of the day and to be free of consequence. If you look at the historic demonstrations like the suffragettes or any number of political disruptors in history, they knew they would be arrested, they knew they'd be thrown in jail, and that was part of the deal. So I do think there's this strange sense of entitlement amongst environmental protesters today that they think the law ought not to apply to them. I mean, you won't find any disagreement from me and Paul on free speech. I think free speech is the absolute bedrock of free society and of a democracy. But we do recognise that there is a difference drawn in law between demonstration, freedom of expression, and the kind of thing that Just Stop Oil get up to. There's also a difference between freedom of expression and standing on the street calling for jihad, for genocide. These things are not legal, and nor should they be.
But they would be, one would assume, areas that the police, even if they don't arrest at the time, and we know there are operational reasons why they might not do that, but are trying to arrest afterwards. And you mentioned, sorry, Paul, just to interject quickly, confirmation bias, which is really, I mean, you're both lawyers, I mean, and yet you are sort of still seeing slightly different things in these same protests.
Well, and exactly, in saying that's why we need a law that it applies equally to everyone. And for instance, on Saturday, and about disruption, actually the protesters have been working with the police to make the march as less disruptive as possible. So, for instance, they're not going anywhere near Whitehall or the Cenotaph, and they're doing a route that's completely away from any kind of issues. And if there are people that are a small minority that are committing criminal offences, which you get on a lot of different demonstrations on both left and right, you arrest those people for that offence. And I think there's a naivety among some people on the more right-wing end of the spectrum to say, what we want is more government powers to ban marches they don't like, thinking it will only be used against people they disagree with, and not thinking that in a few years' time the government might ban their march.
On that point, Paul, if there were to be another march this weekend with the EDL popping up with placards saying, "This doesn't look like my England anymore," would you be all right with that?
Yes.
You'd be OK with that? Because that's the kind of area, you know, is it anti-Israel, is it pro-Palestine?
Actually, one of my favourite things as a British person is to go up to a protest that I don't agree with on the street and have a good old debate with them. And I've done it repeatedly to lots of people I disagree with and say, actually, I think your placard is nonsense, and then challenge them on it. That's I think, the British way, not this slightly... not this thing of just banning things we disagree or don't like.
But obviously then it crosses the line once it becomes illegal, once it becomes hate speech, and that's where the kind of grey area is. One man's hate speech is another man's freedom of speech.
I think part of the problem is that, for some reason, since October the 7th, the police have taken the most generous possible interpretation of hatred against Jews. So by way of example, if I were to stand outside a mosque and say, "Destroy this mosque," you might say, "Oh, no, well, what he probably means is destroy that mosque's political influence in the community, or destroy, you know, the spirit that mosque embodies."
Okay.
And no one would argue that.
So there are different versions
irrational.
of it. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but we'll carry on talking about it in the break, I'm sure. Luke Gittos and Paul Powlesland.